Hey everybody, this is JDGaming, back today with a Let's Build of Paleozoic Frogs. I'll be frank, this was a theme that for the last 2 or 3 months I really considered making an in-depth introduction for, and maybe even a Yu-Gi-Oh! In real life. The Paleozoics were actually released in the OCG, in Korea actually, as the exclusive Burgesstoma archetype based on the real-world equivalent of the Burgess Shale, a place in British Columbia, basically in Canada, where a lot of these ancient fossils that pretty much became what we know of as the beginning of animal life on Earth might have originated from. So very cool topic, and I was going to do a really fun video, but due to logistics, timing, and literally not having enough of that, combined with my personal nature of basically anytime something's not done, I can't really do anything else until that thing's taken care of. I decided for my mental health and for your guys' entertainment, we're gonna go ahead, just skip that content. If you want to learn more about the Burgess Shale or the Cambrian explosion, find it on YouTube. Lots of videos exist regarding that topic, more documentary style, but some of them are more interesting than you may expect. It's basically the beginning of life, if you think of it that way. Very, very cool stuff. But we decided, yeah, let's stick with Yu-Gi-Oh! Gameplay, because I think anyone who watches the channel would agree, I give more than enough info in terms of how these cards work, how the archetypes function, even if it is a brand new thing. So we're going to skip the in real life and in-depth introduction and go straight into building the deck for you guys today from the ground up. So, as that suggests, it is going to be a let's build. I'll talk about all my choices, why things are in here, in the quantities that they are. If you want to just skip to the profile that you usually see, I do an alphabetical style. You can click on the description box down below for the timestamp that'll take you there, or any of the other sections. If you still have any questions after that, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. But without further ado, let's build Paleozoic Frogs. The first step in building any deck is to establish the theme and to build a core that supports the theme's goals. And since here today we're talking about Paleozoic Frogs, we are very reasonably talking about Paleozoic cards and the frog cards. So starting here with one of the Paleozoic trap cards, this is a series of normal traps that follow the same kind of pattern. If they are in your graveyard and a trap card is activated by either player, you're able to special summon it to your field as a 1200 attack, 0 defense, level 2 aqua water monster that has no effect. It's just a normal monster. However, interestingly, it is still treated as a lingering condition of this trap card as something that cannot be affected by other monster effects, which is pretty interesting. It's almost like these cards are so old as creatures, they're not going to interact in the same expected ways with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters. So keep that layer of protection in mind. They are quite powerful because of that. If they happen to leave the field through traditional means, like being used as link material or otherwise, they would end up getting banished. However, realize they wouldn't be banished if you were to use them as Xyz material for a rank 2 summon. So that's one of the things we want to keep in mind. Beyond that commonality of all the Paleozoic monsters, they all have a different trap ability that makes them playable as regular trap cards. And out of the 10 cards, I want to talk about a total of 4 trap cards and 2 Xyz monsters for 6 of them today. Some of the other ones do exist as tech options and subpar choices, so feel free to look at those, but I'll focus on these 4 today. The first one you see here is Paleozoic 𝗑𝖊𝖊𝖑, and this thing you may have seen if you played in Duel Links has been a very sought-after powerful card for a long time. It's basically Book of Moon. Upon activation, allows you to target a face-up monster on the field and change it to face-down defense position. Although, of course, that doesn't directly affect link monsters, it's still very powerful in allowing you to shut a monster down before it becomes a link monster, or turning off its effects before it's able to use an ignition effect, something along those lines. So that's why we play, in this case, 2 or 3 copies of this, but we'll get to why in just a little bit, why I personally run 3 of each of these. We're also playing 3 copies of 𝕮𝖆𝖊𝖑𝖑. This thing is most similar to Karma Cut, a trap card that lets you discard a card from your hand in order to target a monster and then banish that monster. Karma Cut would, of course, get rid of other copies of it. This thing, unfortunately, is not able to get rid of the other copies, but it is able to get rid of any card. Doesn't have to be a monster, just has to be any face-up card. So Pretty cool, and it actually doesn't have any additional issues beyond that. It's just discard any card. Doesn't have to be Paleozoic, could be, for all you care, Dangers if you really wanted to do something that silly. So, you know, you could go ahead and play something like that in here as well. But 𝕮𝖄𝖏𝑇𝖑 is just spot removal on any monsters. We have 𝕮𝖄𝖇𝖑s or 𝕮𝖄𝖇𝖑s. This thing is basically MST, being able to pop a spell or trap card, which is a very useful ability to have these days against fields, traps, and pendulum scales and all the like. And finally, for the core Paleozoic monsters, we are playing Paleozoic 𝗲𝗏𝖊𝖓. This thing is foolish burial goods for your normal trap cards. It's a very powerful card. It basically lets you get one of your Paleozoics into the graveyard and is fully chainable to anything, meaning you can very easily set up and trigger your Paleozoic cards, not in one fell swoop, but still a very flexible enabler for the strategy, and it's able to put in some other tech cards into your graveyard as well. Think of things like Breakthrough Skill or some of the other options that we'll talk about down the line in this deck as well. So very powerful card. Usually if you're not running any of these, or at least considering it, you may want to look at how you look at Paleozoics. Unless the format is so ridiculously fast that your deck cannot afford to play the 𝗲𝗏𝖊𝖓, it ends up being such a flexible card for the strategy that it's just very important to at least consider this thing in your build. So from there are some other cards, power boosters, debuffers, a draw card that isn't actually as good as it looks like on paper, and even a card that lets you return some of your banished cards, which is used as tech from time to time. But that's essentially it for the 4 main Paleozoic cards. The 4 other ones, feel free to look into. They tend to not be played very competitively, mainly because they're very situational or don't really have as high a payoff as you would hope. However, we are going to be playing both of the 𝗮𝖏𝖇𝑑 monsters. Pictured here is Paleozoic 𝗮𝗍𝖑, a rank 2, who is a water aqua monster, needs 2 level 2 monsters to summon, and it shares the same cannot be affected by other monsters' effects, which is a nice little bonus. Has 0 attack, unfortunately, so we'll probably play this in defense, but that's totally fine. You can also, when this card exists, activate Paleozoic traps from your hand. Oh, that's a pretty good ability. 𝗮𝗍𝖏𝖑, the Destructor, is banned for good reason, and this thing basically lets you bypass the regularly slow nature of trap cards. In addition, if it happens to have a trap card as 𝗮𝑐𝑠 material, namely a Paleozoic monster, you can detach a material from this card to add a Paleozoic trap from your deck to your hand. And although you can't use the search effect more than once per turn as a hard once per turn, it still does come up every once in a while where you're able to search whatever trap you want, activate it, get out of a bad situation, and don't forget, because it's an 𝗮𝑐𝑠 monster, detaching it means that the monster kind of went from 𝗮𝑐𝑠 material off the board space, purgatory, into the graveyard, so it never actually leaves the field in the traditional way. It will not banish the Paleozoic trap card, and it'll go right back to your graveyard where you're then able to trigger it back to the field and continue making 𝗮𝑐𝑠 summons. So do keep that in mind as a basic ruling for 𝗮𝑐𝑠 monsters. And very similarly here, we have Paleozoic 𝗍𝗏𝖊𝖓𝖑, which actually means something along the lines of strange shrimp from my research on the video. This thing is a similar monster, but needs 3 or more level 2 monsters, or more is actually kind of something you want to keep in mind. It does have 2400 attack and 0 defense, which is the reverse of the 𝗮𝗍𝖏𝖑, and it says it's also unaffected by other monster effects, as you would expect. Once per turn, if a trap card or cards is sent from your spell and trap card zone to the graveyard, except during the damage step, because they got killed or because you resolved them, you can excavate the top card of your deck, and if it's a trap, you can just add it to your hand. Otherwise, it goes to the graveyard. But when you play a deck like this, and like 99% of your deck is traps, you're very often going to get free pluses off of that effect. Once per turn, during either player's turn, if this card has a trap as 𝗮𝑐𝑠 material, you could detach one of its materials in order to target a card on the field and destroy it. Can you say Zodiac Trident to anyone? This card is very powerful. Does it come up a lot? Nowadays, to be honest, not as much as you would think, mainly because things like Boral Sword Dragon are so good at ending the game that you may as well invest your resources in that direction. However, there are going to be select instances where something like this gives you a ton of control and removal power, and so it's something worth having in your extra deck toolbox with the variety and the fact that it synergizes with the overall Paleozoic theme. Now we're going to hop to the other half of the deck here with the Frog engine, and you may have expected the reason we play these guys is because they fit the theme of level 2 water aqua monsters that fit into our Paleozoic 𝗮𝑐𝑠 material requirements. Swap Frog here is the king of the Frog engine, sitting at 1,000 attack, 500 defense, has an ability that says you can discard a water monster from your hand to special summon this from your hand, and when this card is summoned in any way, you could select and basically foolish burial a frog monster or any level 2 or lower aqua water type monster from your deck or your side of the field to the graveyard. Then once per turn, you have an additional ability where you can bounce this card back to your hand in order to get one more normal summon of a frog monster that is not 𝕿𝖆𝖇𝖑𝖊, which was of course renamed to Slime Toad, and another copy of Swap Frog, just so you can't keep normal summoning this thing. This thing is a huge enabler. The biggest things it's able to do is summon itself for free if you happen to draw it with other monsters, and you can go ahead and yard a bunch of frog monsters to the graveyard, including a very overpowered, at least from back in the day standards, overpowered Ronin Totem. So this thing is from the Synchro era. It's another level 2, not quite a frog, but honorary frog. His name is treated as Death Frog while it's on the field. It's got 100 attack, 2,000 defense, and it says you can banish a frog monster in your graveyard except 𝕿𝖆𝖇𝖑𝖊 to special summon this card from the graveyard. It can't be used as synchro material because, God forbid, that would be way too busted, and we can't let you use that. However, it's not once per turn. If you have this thing go back to the graveyard because you use it as link material or you use it as an Xyz material and then detach it, it's able to come right back as long as you have a frog. And that's where this thing lets you go and summon things like Boral Sword Dragon out of nowhere, because since this thing is able to do over 6,000 damage single-handedly, as long as you're able to shift a monster to defense position, guess what? Just summon Ronin Totem again after feeding this guy the materials to summon the Boral Sword, and now you're able to shift the last Ronin Totem to defense position and then just go for the kill. So Ronin Totem ends up becoming an extremely powerful reason you run this engine, but then you need some more frogs, right? Swap Frog's pretty good. Where else do you go from there? Kind of the standard lineup here is going to be 3 copies of Dupe Frog. This thing is also counted as Death Frog on the field, and that's pretty significant just because, as I'll mention later, the Nightmare monsters do require 2 monsters with different names, so do keep that in mind. That's something you may have to keep at the ready if you need to summon a specific type of Link monster or something along those lines. But all you care about here is that it is a frog monster that says it makes it the only possible target for your attacks. Oh, that's pretty cool here. That means if you summon one of these, it's the only thing that can be attacked. Well, what if you summon another one? Well, by rulings, now your opponent can only attack this one and this one, but this one pulls it towards itself and this one pulls it towards itself. Basically, if you have more than one of these things, your opponent cannot attack at all. And that becomes really powerful when you consider the kind of lower attack cap that these monsters tend to have. Anyone playing frogs will also recognize that this is a pretty annoying way that you could set up with Toadally Awesome, which we'll discuss in just a second. So that's where we're going with this engine. And then finally, I kind of misspoke when I said, oh, the only thing you care about. You care about everything with Dupe Frog. The only thing you care about is that this is like the best frog other than Swap Frog and Ronin Totem. So it's like they're all awesome in their own ways. It lets you, when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, so it will miss timing if you use it for its own materials, but get it killed in battle. Your opponent tries to pick it off with a card effect or something to break your dupe loop. You're basically able to recur a frog monster from your graveyard to your hand, so Swap Frog comes right back. Doesn't always come in handy, just because it does miss timing, but do realize that it's at least there. The main reason you play Dupe Frog, though, is it's a frog, and it does have that annoying defensive capability. From here, now we have 8 water aqua level 2 monsters, as well as our 12 Paleozoics that we've introduced, so no brainer, we are going to be playing like the best Xyz monster printed, Toadally Awesome, or as they call it in Japan, 𝕿𝖆𝖇𝖑𝖊, which is basically a way of saying rice cake frog or treat toad. So this thing is a generic-ish card for the deck. It just needs any 2 aqua water type monsters, or rather 2 aqua monsters, which is basically either Paleozoics or frogs or both or whatever. So very easy to summon. 2200 attack, 0 defense, and it reads once per turn during the standby phase of either turn, you could attach one of its materials to special summon a frog monster from your deck. So if you're able to establish a board with Toadally Awesome and a Dupe Frog, then going into your opponent's standby phase, you use this effect to special summon the second Dupe Frog, and now your 2200 attack monster is impervious to destruction by battle because your opponent has to pick off your Dupe Frogs before they can make any attack at all. And if they do that, of course, chances are they're going to trigger the Dupe Frog and then get you a free card back. So you end up with a lot of free resources to go into Toadally Awesome and then keep going with plays after. But the main reason, of course, you play Toadally Awesome is because of its ridiculous Omni-Negate ability. Once per turn, when during either player's turn, your opponent activates a spell or trap card or a monster effect, you can send a face-up aqua type monster from your hand, or I guess from your field, face up from your field or from your hand to the graveyard in order to negate the activation of the card. And if you do, destroy that. Then if you successfully destroyed it because it was on the field, you can set it to your field. So your opponent plays �11𝖊𝖓𝖙𝖊𝖓𝖐 and tries to bomb your field. You now have a �11𝖊𝖊𝖓𝐷 on your field, and your opponent has failed to accomplish their original objective here. So very, very annoying card. If you think about it, a lot of times you're using this Solemn Judgment-esque ability to stop your opponent's one answer to your field. But if then that can be turned against them, that's silly, and that's what this card is able to do. OCG has this thing limited for good reason. We have it at 3 though, because of, I guess, not enough people playing it, low representation. So very much it is a card we want to take advantage of. Rejoice, Frog players. We still have 3 copies of this card, at least as of the making of this video. I don't see it going any lower anytime soon. However, if it did, I kind of think it would make sense because of how powerful the card is. From here, we're going to look at the final ability, which says if you happen to have this card sent from the field to the graveyard, so let's say you get it with its own ability, you send it to the graveyard, you can recur 1 water monster from your graveyard to your hand, which means you can either recycle Toadally Awesome in the event that it ends up being limited, or better yet, if you have more copies of this in your extra deck anyway, just add a swap frog, dupe frog, something along those lines to your hand, and you have an extra monster that you could go and make bigger plays with in the following turn. So very powerful boss monster, in no way underrated. This card is just ridiculous, and back in the day, people were trying to play Bahamut Shark in order to play this in generic rank 4 decks. It is obviously at home in this strategy, and you want to make sure you maximize on the Toadally Awesome. And now with the 2 main cores out of the way, we're going to make a mad dash to the finish where we talk about both the main deck tech as well as the extra deck, because now that we have kind of this new theme for the channel introduced, a lot of these elements end up being pretty familiar. I'll still talk about the key things here, but we're gonna go and kind of go through things in a little bit more of a swift manner. Starting off, I want to look at 2 very powerful tech options that we'll be playing here, and that kind of dictate the direction of the deck. We will be playing 3 copies of Trap-centric, which is a relatively new trap card. It's a normal trap that says banish a normal trap from your deck, except a copy of Trap-centric, to send 1 card, or set rather, 1 card with the same name directly from your deck. Also, it is allowed to be activated that turn. You can only activate 1 trap card for the rest of the turn after this effect resolves, and you can only activate 1 Trap-centric per turn. But essentially, this thing is basically a wild card that lets you play any trap that you want that's a normal trap directly from your deck, if you will. And although it limits you after you play this card, you can always use this as the kind of icing on the cake, last nail in the coffin, if you will, to end your opponent's turn from them trying to make a bunch of power plays against you. So very powerful. Notice here, you require 2 copies of any of the tech cards going forward in order to actually resolve Trap-centric. That's why I wanted to main at least 2 copies of all the Paleozoic monsters, but you may have noticed I played 3 of every single one. And the reason for that specifically is because of another consistency booster, Lilith. This thing is something that some Frog players play, some people don't. I personally love this thing. You guys know what I feel about the Lair of Darkness strategy. It's just a really cool deck. I love it. But Lilith is a level 3 fiend monster, dark, and its 2000 attack that is quickly halved to 1000 when you normal summon her, which is what you're doing in this deck. As a quick effect, you could tribute a dark monster, basically only her in this deck, at any point in order to reveal 3 trap cards from your deck. They have to be normal traps. Then your opponent has to randomly choose one of them to set onto your field. They don't look at it because it's random, and then you shuffle the rest of the cards back into the deck. You can only use this effect of Lilith once per turn, but effectively playing 2 or 3 copies of this card means now you have 6 ways that you can tutor out any of your normal trap cards, your Paleozoics or otherwise. And so this gives a huge boost in consistency. Lots of other draw cards exist, like Pot of Desires, but that destroys your main deck, right? Pot of Extravagance, but that rips apart your extra deck where you want to hang on to things. Even things like Reckless Greed don't end up being the best options, I felt in testing, because when you already have 6 copies of cards that let you grab whatever you need from your deck at any time, it's better to choose those than it is to get random pluses. Card advantage is obviously important, but mathematically, the Reckless Greeds, like getting the second copy with one of these in order to make the downside irrelevant, isn't as good as just searching directly for one of your 6 best cards in your deck. And so that's why I chose this specific engine over, you know, the card of demise and all that stuff. It's just my personal preference. Obviously, people have different ways of going about it, but I do think it's important now that since we've decided this is the direction we're going to go, now we have to realize, oh, Lilith requires us to play potentially 3 copies of a card if we want to see it as a guarantee, and that's why I played 3 of every Paleozoic card. You can feel free to cut down on the number of Lilith or even cut it entirely in order to play some of the other draw spells and maybe even, fandangle some of the numbers on some of these other cards. But effectively, I wanted a streamlined list, and that's where we are going from this point on. So Lilith and Trap-centric, both very powerful, but do keep in mind, you need to have a certain number of cards in your deck that are eligible targets in order to make the most of them. So then from here, we are playing 3 copies of our only hand trap. You could play other traps, but or hand traps rather, but Infinite Impermanence is basically an effect veiler that synergizes with all the trap cards in this deck. It's searchable, it triggers your Paleozoics, and it can be played from your hand, just like Veiler. Plus, it has the bonus ability of, if it was set, you can blank spell and traps in the column, which does come up from time to time as well. So quickly becoming one of my favorite cards just between a lot of decks and the control decks that I'm playing these days, but definitely a card that is at home here. People used to play Lost Wind and Breakthrough Skill in this strategy, but I personally like Impermanence more than those, especially because if you use Lilith or Trap-centric, you can also choose to set this thing, sometimes with Trap-centric, on your opponent's turn, wherever they may have a spell or trap brewing, and that's a really cool thing that you could do with this card as well. So very powerful, flexible card. Play at least 2 for Trap-centric. I like playing 3 just so I can Lilith it as well. Another card I'm very happy to see from back in Dragon Ruler format is 3 full copies of CompVac, Compulsory Evacuation Device. This thing, of course, is an inherent -1. It's basically like Book of Moon, where it just takes one monster and tries to solve the problem involving it. But nowadays, you're seeing so many link monsters that are, going to cost 2 or more cards, and the flexibility of just taking a card and bouncing it off the field is extremely powerful, especially when you're able to set it at will and have this complicate your back row. So now you have the 𝗮𝖊𝖇𝖑𝖊, which is basically Book of Moon. You have this removing things. You have Deinonychus as spot removal. Most monsters without inherent protection are going to be in trouble, and especially if your opponent's trying to play a fragile strategy that's trying to combo up into different things, this ends up becoming very powerful, and is able to snag some pluses if you hit, some of those more costly cards to put into play. So definitely love the 3 copies of that. Then we're playing a full 3 copies of Heavy Storm Duster as well. Nowadays especially, you're seeing a lot of decks that run trap cards, pendulum scales, things like that, and you can snipe 2 of the cards without a cost, but it's a normal trap. So again, searchable, triggers all your things. That's kind of the theme here. And the fact that you skip your battle phase the turn you activate it doesn't matter, because a lot of times you're playing it during your opponent's turn. It is an absolute blowout of a card, especially in mirror matches or similar matches against like Altergeists and such. So definitely want to have access to that, at least in the side. But honestly, I feel like it's pretty good in the main these days as well. From here, we're done with the normal traps for now. I want to play some powerhouses to increase the power and variety in the strategy. So we're playing 3 copies of Solemn Strike. None of the others, no Warning, no Judgment. You could honestly play some of those, but I ultimately figured personally that Solemn Strike gives you the most reach. Judgment is amazing, but you already have Totally Awesome, and you kind of pay way too much in a trap deck by paying half your life when you really want to survive. And sometimes you need to take hits in order to choose to activate your best trap cards later than your opponent thinks you're able to. So for the sake of holding on to traps, I want to keep my life points. 1,500 is nothing, but it gives me a lot of reach, more so than Warning, which also costs 2,000, and that's why we're playing 3 copies of this and none of the other Solemns. But of course, you could play more of the other Solemns. They're very powerful cards. I just want to have as many life points as possible, and that's why I chose that. Speaking of life points, though, Imperial Order is powerful enough to warrant play, because when you're still playing against Sky Strikers and other combo decks that just need their spells, it just single-handedly wins you games. So if nothing else, side deck this card, but definitely have access to it because it's an auto win against a lot of strategies. And as you may have seen, we're playing no spell cards at all. In fact, we're playing a 40-card deck here, of which we have 8 frogs and 3 Lilith, so 11 monsters. The other 29 cards are all traps, and this card is a very powerful card to stop your opponent's draw spells and everything else that they need for their combo. So part of another reason why I don't want to play draw spells specifically here is because they're kind of subpar for this deck the way I want to play it, and then Imperial Order is just so much better. And finally, the last card I'm teching is a single copy of Spiritual Swords of Revealing Light, mainly because of Trap-centric's Marella. This card is a continuous trap, so it looks not searchable initially, but it says once per attack, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can pay 1,000 life to negate the attack. so kind of a mediocre defensive card if you have it on the field. Why would you even do it? It could be destroyed, right? Well, you use �11 and �11𝖊𝖓𝗙𝖊𝖓𝗙 Burial Goods it right to the graveyard, where it says during your opponent's turn, you can banish it as a quick effect because it's a trap card, and make it so your opponent cannot attack directly that turn. So that card makes it so �11 can be played at will to trigger your Paleozoics, and then you can also protect yourself later in the game whenever your opponent tries to make a game-winning push. They'll often forget about this card because, you know, it's not commonly seen or anything, but it's a very powerful target for that Paleozoic �11in making sure that you don't die when your opponent tries to push you. So that's why we are playing this. Now we're done with the main deck. We're going to jump right over to the extra deck. So we have here, starting at link 2, Akashic Magician. This thing actually comes up quite a lot, especially in tandem with Security Dragon. Both of these need 2 monsters to summon. They both point up and down. Akashic Magician needs 2 monsters of the same type that aren't tokens, but again, very easy to do because you have Paleozoic monsters and the frog monsters are all Aqua level 2 monsters. So very easy to set up. 1700 attack, and says when you summon it, you bounce everything it's pointing to. So sometimes it's not even miss-zoning where things go. Your opponent just has to summon like an �11𝖊𝖏𝗑 or �11𝖊𝖓𝗏𝗏 or something along those lines that has an arrow towards you. You just summon this there, bounce it away as long as it's not �11𝖊𝖏𝗏𝗏 or you have a response to its ability. But you can kick things away very easily. Once you have that on the field, you also have an ability that says if you happen to have it co-linked to anything, let's say to the Security Dragon here, you're able to go and say, okay, well, I'm co-linked to a monster with a total link rating of 2, so now I can call a card name, any card in the game, excavate that number of cards, so I have 2 cards in this case from the top of my deck, and if there happens to be any copies of those, I can add them right to my hand. So let's say Swap Frog. Okay, dig for Swap Frog. I didn't see any Swap Frogs, but hey, I saw a couple Paleozoics. Now they're in the graveyard because it'll send the rest of the excavated cards to the graveyard. So very interesting ability. It's like a nice jack of all trades for different things: removal, excavation, draw filtering as well. And especially when you combo it with Security Dragon, as you're very easily able to do. Security Dragon says once while it's co-linked to a monster, you can just target a monster your opponent controls and bounce it to the hand, and that clears boards out rather for game, because you could easily follow these plays up with a Boral Sword Dragon rather, just by bringing back Ronin Toadin and then, you know, just sweep your opponent for game. So that's why those cards are here. I still like Nightmare Cerberus in addition to Phoenix in this deck, because since you have a little bit of wiggle room in the extra deck, might as well have some options, and it's very easy again to co-link with these monsters. The only thing you want to keep in mind with these 2 monsters, as well as the link 3 Nightmare Phoenix, or not Phoenix, the Nightmare Unicorn, is that they do need 2 monsters with different names, and all your frogs technically become 𝗏𝗏𝐻 while they're on the field. So just make sure that you don't accidentally, choose a monster that you can't summon with. Swap Frog is still fine. It stays a Swap Frog, but Dupe Frog and Ronin Toadin do count as 𝗏𝗏𝐻. So just make sure you pair it with either Swap Frog or with one of the Paleozoic monsters, and then you won't have any issues if you keep that one thing in mind. But removal for monsters, removal for spell and traps, and removal for anything, all at a discard cost that can be very easily replaced by having it co-linked to one of your cards. Very easy to summon, generic, and protects your monsters that are co-linked from battle, protects your monsters that are co-linked from card effect destruction, and extra draws if you happen to have multiple things out. You rarely summon like a full package of these or anything, but they're just good problem solvers to have, and very generic, accessible cards, still worth playing because of that simple reason. Then a single copy, of Miss Starboy. This thing is just 2 water monsters, gives a big buff to everything. I don't always use this thing, to be honest. I tend to use Akashic Magician, Security Dragon, follow up into Boral Sword a lot more often, but still a very generic, powerful card that can honestly add up its attack power on all of your creatures. Like getting Toadally Awesome up to 27 is very solid, of course, but just having a bunch of frogs, they all get 500 extra attack, and if you're just poking with all of them, that can add up to a lot of damage sometimes as well. So just keep it in mind, it's a very useful card. Wouldn't really play more than 2 copies max in most situations, unless you're running Extravagance or something, but definitely the 1 copy gives you access to it when you need it. And then from here, we'll talk about kind of the last few tech rank 4s or link 4s. We have 𝗏𝗏𝖊𝖏𝗏𝗏. This thing is just a no-brainer. We used to play 𝗏𝗏𝖊𝗏𝗏𝗏 as kind of just an easy to summon rank 4 that has 2 monsters and all these arrows. Now you have that, but this card's even better because you actually have negation abilities that you can put on top of your Toadally Awesomes and your traps. So very welcome addition to the extra deck. We're playing a single copy of Boral Dragon. Sword is obviously how you win the game, but Boral is still very good at getting rid of your opponents like Avramax or other annoying cards that you may not be able to otherwise. So since you have free link materials anyway, having the option is very good. And then a copy of 𝕮𝖓𝖊𝖓𝖙𝖊𝖓𝖓 as well. This thing is very similar to the other nightmares in just summoning conditions and stuff, but it lets you, upon summon, if it's co-linked, discard a card in order to take a spell or trap and set it back to your field. And because you're playing a trap deck, this is a very relevant card, I feel. It doesn't come up all the time, just like the other nightmares, but again, situations where you could use it will arise, and especially in more complicated game states, you can further complicate it and hopefully come ahead, because now you get a pick of any card in your graveyard as a reverse toolbox. If you watched this video in its entirety, thanks. Hopefully you guys enjoyed seeing the creation of this deck as much as I did putting it together for you guys. We'll start off here with the main deck. We have triple Dupe Frog, triple Lilith, Lady of Lament, double Ronin Totem, and triple Swap Frog for a total of 11 monsters, 0 spells, and a very hearty 29 trap count. So here we go, boys. We got triple Compulsory Evacuation Device, triple Heavy Storm Duster, 1 Imperial Order only because it's limited. Then we have triple Infinite Impermanence. Then for all the Paleozoics I'm playing here, triple each of Canadia, which is Book of Moon, Dinomischus, which is Karmic Cut, Marilla, which is Foolish Burial Goods, and Olenoidus, which is MST, Mystical Space Typhoon. Then we have triple Solemn Strike, a lone copy of Spiritual Swords of Revealing Light as our tech play for Marilla, and triple Trap-centric for 40 cards to round out the main deck. Now jumping over to our extra deck, we have, starting with the Link monsters at Link 2, Akashic Magician, Nightmare Cerberus and Phoenix, Mistarboy, and Security Dragon for our Link 2s. Then for Link 3, we have Nightmare Unicorn. Link 4, we have the mighty 𝕿𝗿𝖑𝖊𝖓𝖓𝖓, Bow of the Goddess, the Boroboros in Sword and Load Dragons. Then we have Nightmare Griffin as well, just because it kind of synergizes with the strategy, you know. Then for Xyz monsters, we play a single copy each of Paleozoic 𝕿𝖆𝖇𝖑𝖊𝖓𝖙𝖊𝖓𝖓 and Anomalous Charis, and then finally 3 copies of Totally Awesome, because that's just the type of card that it is. That's it for now, but feel free to grab one of these videos on your way out. If you really enjoyed what you saw today, remember to subscribe to JDGaming for more Yu-Gi-Oh videos. Thanks guys, this is JDGaming, hope you guys enjoyed as always, and I'll see you guys next time.